Close your eyes for a moment, or simply let your body relax. And as you listen, allow your thoughts to slow down like clouds drifting across a vast, silent sky. There is nothing you need to do here, no place you need to go, only a story unfolding slowly through time. A story meant for the quiet hours of the night, when the world feels distant and history begins to speak in whispers. So let your mind settle and your breath grow calm as we travel back to a time long forgotten, to the endless steppes of ancient Mongolia, where the wind never stops and the horizon has no end. Because before he became a name carved into history, before he became an empire, he was only a child, hungry, alone, and surviving in a world that gave him nothing. And from that silence, our story begins. The story you are about to hear does not begin with an empire. It begins with hunger. Not the kind of hunger written in history books, but the kind that rewires a child's mind. The kind that teaches him, before anything else, that the world does not owe him survival. Because long before the world knew the name Genghis Khan, there was only Temujin, a boy born into a land where life was not guaranteed, and death did not need permission. And if history had shifted even slightly, his name would have vanished like thousands of others swallowed by the steppe. But something happened. Not something loud, not something visible, something almost too small to notice at the time, but powerful enough to reshape continents. And it begins here. A child standing in a world that does not recognize his importance, not yet, not ever. At least, that is what everyone around him believes. Temujin was born into the Borjigan clan, a name that once carried respect, but by the time of his childhood, that respect had already begun to decay. His father, a tribal leader, was poisoned by rivals during a time when alliances shifted faster than seasons, and on the steppe, a bloodline without protection is only a memory waiting to disappear. After his father's death, everything collapsed almost immediately. Alliances dissolved, promises evaporated. Even those who once shared his family's fire turned away, as if distance alone could erase obligation. And this reveals an early truth of that world. Power is never inherited. It is always taken. And at that moment, Temujin's family had nothing left to take anything with. His mother, Hoilun, was forced into a life that was not survival, but resistance against disappearance. Food became uncertain, shelter became temporary, and safety became something remembered from another life. The children learned to dig through frozen earth for roots, not as exploration, but as desperation made physical. And in the steppe, hunger does not stay physical for long. It spreads. It changes the way people look at each other. It erodes patience, then trust, then something deeper. The feeling of being safe, even within your own family. But what makes Temujin's early life unsettling is not only what he lost, it is what he began to understand too early. Children in that world do not grow, they adapt quickly. Every mistake carries weight. Every sound in the distance could mean movement. Every stranger is not just unknown, but unclassified danger. And danger did come early, not as war, not as conquest, but as abandonment. His own tribe, the people who were supposed to be bound to him, made a decision, and then simply left. No ceremony, no explanation, just absence, as if the family had never existed at all. To adults, it was politics. To Temujin, it was erasure. And something begins forming in that silence. Not hatred, not yet. Something colder. Awareness. The understanding that loyalty is temporary and permanence is an illusion people comfort themselves with. Years pass like this, not as chapters, but as cycles. Hunger, movement, survival, silence, until one day, history narrows into a single moment. Temujin is captured, not in battle, not in glory, but during one of the many small conflicts that constantly fracture the steppe. A rival group surrounds him and places a wooden collar around his neck, a simple object, but in that world, it carries a complete meaning: ownership, the reduction of a human life into property. And for the first time, Temujin is no longer surviving as a free person. He is surviving as something owned. And this is where most stories end. But his begins to change, because captivity does something strange to the mind. It removes movement. It removes choice. And in doing so, it sharpens awareness. He begins to observe everything, not out of hope, but necessity. The rhythm of guards, the timing of distractions, the small gaps in attention that most people never notice because they are too afraid to look. and slowly he learns something dangerous. Power always leaves patterns behind. Then, one moment breaks the pattern. Noise, movement, a brief collapse of attention during a gathering. Not chaos of war, but chaos of ordinary human distraction. And in that fraction of time, he makes his decision. No weapon, no army, no witness willing to help him. Only timing. He escapes. But escape is not freedom. It is exposure, because now the world does not simply hold him. It searches for him. He moves through hostile land where even silence feels watched. Every step is a risk. Every shadow feels like a memory of being followed. And this is where something begins to shift. Not physically, but internally. He is no longer only surviving. He is learning how survival systems work, and that knowledge changes everything. History often marks empires as beginning with wars, or leaders, or victories, but sometimes it begins much earlier, in silence, in hunger, in abandonment, and in the quiet persistence of someone who refuses to disappear. Because survival under conditions like these is not passive. It is momentum forming in human shape, and momentum, once it begins, almost never stops. After his escape, the world did not feel larger. It felt colder, because freedom in the steppe does not mean safety. It only means you are now visible to everything that wants you gone. Temujin moved without direction. No home, no tribe, no protection, only the constant awareness that silence behind him might not be empty. It might be following him. And then came one of the most overlooked but defining periods of his life, a phase that history rarely emphasizes, but psychologically reshaped him forever. He became invisible, not metaphorically, literally, a boy alone in a land where even shadows belonged to someone else. There were nights when he did not sleep, not because of fear alone, but because the steppe itself feels alive at night. Wind moves across grass like whispers, and in the distance, wolves answer the silence, not as a threat, but as a reminder. Everything here survives by consuming something else, and then something happened that would become one of the first quiet betrayals of his life. Temujin found temporary shelter among people who did not know him well, a fragile pause in his suffering. For a brief moment, it seemed like survival had softened. Food became slightly more regular, fire existed more often, and human voices replaced silence. But in the steppe, comfort is never neutral. It always has a cost hidden behind it. One night, that cost revealed itself. A disagreement, a suspicion, a whisper that grows faster than truth ever can. And suddenly, the same people who shared food with him began to look at him differently, not as a child, but as a risk, as something uncertain, something replaceable. And in a world where survival depends on eliminating uncertainty, uncertainty does not last long. Temujin was forced to leave again. No confrontation, no explanation, just the quiet removal of presence, as if he had never been there at all. This moment mattered more than it appears, because it confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. Safety is temporary everywhere, even among those who smile at you, even around firelight, even inside kindness. But the deeper transformation was not external. It was internal. Something in him stopped expecting permanence and instead began studying patterns. Who changes behavior first? Who avoids eye contact? Who speaks less when fear enters a room? He was learning people the way others learn terrain, not emotionally, but analytically. And then came a darker chapter, a rumor that would shape the next violent turn of his life. One of his early companions, a boy named Jamuka, would later become one of the most important and dangerous figures in his story. But at this stage, they were not enemies. They were something far more unstable. They were bonded, not by loyalty, but by shared survival. And in the steppe, shared survival often becomes shared ambition. There is a moment in every great historical transformation when friendship begins to shift into comparison. Who leads first? Who others listen to? Who people naturally follow without realizing it? Temujin noticed this early, even as a boy. Even without a name, people reacted differently to him, not because he demanded attention, but because silence around him never felt empty. It felt controlled. And this is where the first invisible fracture appears. Jamuka begins to sense it too, not openly, not immediately, but in the way people respond when both of them are present, in the way conversations subtly move toward Temujin's direction, in the way decisions pause, as if waiting for something unspoken. And jealousy in the steppe is not emotional, it is strategic. it becomes calculation. Meanwhile, Temujin's life was still not stable enough to be called a life. Another event breaks through. He is captured again. But this time, the feeling is different. Not shock, not panic, but recognition, as if captivity is no longer an accident, but a repeating pattern of his existence. And what follows is more disturbing than the first capture, because this time he understands the system more clearly. He knows how people justify ownership, how they normalize control, how cruelty becomes routine when repeated enough times. And in that environment, he witnesses something that stays with him far longer than the chains. He sees how quickly humans adapt to authority, even when it's unjust, even when it's cruel, even when it's wrong. One night during this captivity, something shifts, a moment of distraction again. But this time, it is not just escape. It is observation of something deeper. People do not guard the important things carefully. They guard what they believe cannot escape. And that belief becomes their weakness. He escapes again. But this escape is different from the first, because now he is not only escaping captivity, he is escaping expectation. The expectation that he will remain powerless, and as he disappears into the steppe once more, something begins forming that history does not yet recognize. Not leadership, not empire, not war, but something more dangerous in the long term, consistency under collapse. And this is where the tone of his life changes permanently, because from this point onward, Temujin is no longer simply surviving events. Events are now shaping around him, like pressure building before a storm that has not yet decided where to fall. And somewhere in the silence of the steppe, history quietly adjusts itself without realizing it is already beginning to bend toward him. After his second escape, Temujin did not return to innocence, because repetition changes perception. The first time you escape captivity, it feels like survival. The second time, it feels like pattern recognition. And Temujin began to understand something most people never realize. The world does not change randomly. It repeats behaviors on different scales. Only the names and faces change. But survival alone was no longer enough, because now something else began to happen around him. People started noticing him, not in a dramatic way, not with speeches or claims of power, but in small, quiet reactions, a pause before disagreement, a hesitation before decision, a natural shift in attention when he spoke, even if what he said was simple. And in the steppe, attention is the first form of authority. He did not ask for followers, but slowly they began to appear. Not warriors, not leaders, but people like him, drifters, outcasts, those who had also been erased by tribes, politics, or betrayal. People who had nothing left to lose are the easiest to bind to a new direction, because they are not looking for comfort. They are looking for meaning inside survival. Temujin never offered them promises. He could not. The world he lived in did not respect promises. Instead, he offered something more dangerous: consistency, fairness in decisions, clarity in conflict. And in a place where authority was usually violent and unpredictable, this alone felt unnatural. But something darker was forming at the same time. Jamuka, his once companion, his mirror in survival, was no longer just moving alongside him. He was observing him differently now. An observation in the steppe is rarely neutral. It becomes comparison, and comparison becomes judgment. There's a moment in every rivalry when two people realize they are no longer walking the same path. It does not happen with words. It happens in silence, in how others stand around them, in how decisions are accepted without question when one speaks and debated when the other does. And that imbalance slowly builds pressure. Temujin felt it first in the behavior of others. Jamuka felt it first in emotion. And this difference would define everything that followed, because one was learning systems and the other was feeling displacement. Then came a turning point that history often treats as minor, but psychologically, it was explosive. A small group of followers were punished under tribal custom, a conflict over loyalty, a disagreement over distribution of resources. And in that moment, Jamuka made a decision that would split reality into two futures. He chose traditional authority, harsh punishment, public execution, a reminder that order must be feared. But Temujin saw something else, not morality, not rebellion, but inefficiency. He saw how fear creates obedience, but destroys long-term loyalty. And this difference in thinking would later become the foundation of an empire. At that time, however, it only created tension, unspoken, invisible but irreversible. And as seasons passed, Temujin's group slowly grew. Not rapidly, not dramatically, but steadily, like water filling cracks in stone. Each person who joined wasn't drawn by glory, but by structure and chaos. But expansion attracts attention, and attention in the steppe always brings consequence. A message arrives from Jamukha, not a friendly one, not hostile yet, but symbolic. A reminder that paths that once overlapped are now diverging. And in the steppe, divergence between two rising figures is never peaceful for long. It becomes pressure, then tension, then inevitability. Temujin does not respond immediately. He understands something crucial here. Words at this stage do not resolve conflict. They define it, and once defined, it cannot be reversed. So he waits, observes, builds, because for the first time, he is no longer reacting to life. He is anticipating it. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, unseen by both men, the structure of future war is already forming. Not as armies yet, not as conquest, but as alignment. People choosing sides without fully understanding what they are choosing. And this is the most dangerous stage in any rise to power. Not the beginning, not the battle, but the quiet moment before history decides which name will survive. Temujin does not know it yet, but the world is beginning to organize itself around him. Not because he demands it, but because instability naturally seeks structure, and he is becoming the closest thing to it. And in that silence between two rising figures, history holds its breath. Because what comes next will no longer be survival, it will be conflict, slow, inevitable, and irreversible. Until now, everything seemed to be slowly stabilizing. His group was growing. His influence was quietly spreading. Even the silence around him no longer felt like isolation, but something closer to structure, forming out of chaos. But history never allows stability to last for long, because just when everything appears to align, something shifts in the shadows, something small at first, almost unnoticeable, but powerful enough to change everything that follows. Until this point, it felt like things were finally under control. But then something happened that would quietly begin the unraveling of everything he had built. It did not start with war. It did not start with betrayal you could immediately see. It started with behavior changing in ways that were barely noticeable at first. A slight hesitation before responding to him. A delay before following orders, a silence that felt intentional rather than natural. Temujin noticed it immediately because he had learned to read what others ignored. Then came the first fracture. Within his growing group, a few voices began to question decisions, not openly, not in confrontation, but in whispers that spread faster than any command could control. And in the steppe, whispers are more dangerous than weapons because they travel without resistance. Then, without warning, a small dispute broke out during a simple resource division, something routine, something that should have ended within moments. But in that moment, someone refused his decision, not disagreement, refusal, a direct crack in authority. And for the first time, Temujin felt the atmosphere around him change. Not fear, not anger, but uncertainty. And in the world he was learning to navigate, uncertainty was more dangerous than open conflict. Because once authority is questioned, it never returns in its original form. Then it happened. A messenger arrived, exhausted, barely able to speak, carrying news that was not just information, but collapse disguised as communication. A portion of his followers had been attacked, not by a large army, not by a known rival force, but by a coordinated strike from people who were once neutral or loosely connected to his movement. This was not random violence. This was a message, a warning that his influence had started to attract resistance. And in that moment, something inside Temujin changed, not visibly, but internally. Something hardened quietly, like pressure forming beneath ice, because he now understood something fundamental. Growth does not attract safety. It attracts opposition, but the real shock had not arrived yet. Until this moment, everything could still be interpreted as instability. But then came the second blow. One of his closest early companions, someone who had survived with him through hunger, exile, and silence, disappeared. Not missing in a way that suggested hope, not lost in a way that allowed uncertainty. Taken. And worse than that, there was no clear enemy responsible, only confusion. And in the steppe, unclear enemies are the most dangerous kind because they cannot be confronted directly. Temujin did not react immediately. He did not allow emotion to take control. Instead, he began to observe patterns, timing, movement, and what he discovered was more disturbing than the attack itself. This was not chaos. This was coordination. Someone was testing him, measuring how he would respond under pressure, watching how his structure would behave when stressed. And somewhere far beyond immediate visibility, Jamuka's influence felt closer than before, even if nothing had been openly declared. Then, another message arrived. Not a formal declaration, not a direct threat, but something more subtle, a deliberate withdrawal. A sign that alliances were no longer shared in the same way. That separation had already begun, without agreement, without discussion, without return. And Temujin finally understood what was happening. This was no longer survival. This was division taking shape. And division, once it begins, does not stop on its own. Because before empires rise, friendships must break. And as the wind moved across the endless steppe, it no longer carried silence alone. It carried anticipation of something approaching that could not be avoided any longer. And Temujin stood there, no longer as someone merely surviving the world, but as someone the world had begun to react to. And for the first time, he understood clearly that what he had built could now be destroyed. And someone, somewhere, was already trying. Now, the tension shifts from quiet division into the first real pressure of open conflict. Temujin is no longer just being tested in silence. He is being challenged in motion, on the ground, where survival becomes numbers, chaos, and decision-making under fear. And for the first time, he is outnumbered in a way that should have ended everything, but it does not. Because what follows is not just a battle. It is the first time the world begins to misunderstand him. It began with movement on the horizon, not one army, not one clear enemy, but scattered groups aligning into something larger than before. Temujin's scouts returned with reports that did not fully connect at first. Separate forces, different banners, different origins, but all moving in a coordinated direction toward his position. At first, it looked like coincidence, but coincidence does not move with purpose. And then the realization settled in. This was not a single tribe attacking. This was alignment. Several groups, larger in total number, coming together against him. And for a moment, even his closest followers fell silent because they could count and the numbers were not in their favor. Some of his men began to doubt quietly, not openly, but in the way hands tightened around weapons, in the way eyes lingered too long on the horizon, in the way silence became heavier than speech. And Temujin saw it. He always saw it, but he did not react with reassurance. He reacted with structure. He divided his smaller force into compact units, not based on strength, but on trust, on predictability, on discipline, under fear. And then something unexpected happened inside his camp. A young warrior hesitated before joining one of the units, not out of fear of the enemy, but fear of being placed too far from Temujin's center, because something strange had started to form around him. People no longer believed safety came from numbers. They believed it came from his presence, and that belief was dangerous because belief replaces logic and replaces panic with loyalty. The enemy force finally appeared fully on the horizon. They were larger, significantly larger, a formation built on numbers, confidence, and the assumption that overwhelming force would decide everything quickly. Among Temujin's men, the realization spread like cold water. This should not be survivable. And then, the first strike began. The opposing forces moved fast, expecting immediate collapse. They believed fear would break the smaller army instantly, and at first, it almost worked. The ground shook, the air filled with noise, and Temujin's smaller force absorbed the first impact. A few lines broke, a few men fell back. For a brief moment, it looked like the expected outcome was unfolding exactly as predicted. But then, something shifted. Temujin did not retreat. He adjusted. He pulled his fragmented units inward instead of outward, compressing the battlefield instead of expanding it. And that decision changed the shape of the conflict. The larger force, expecting collapse, suddenly found themselves pulled into tighter engagement zones where their numerical advantage became less effective. Confusion began to spread through their lines because the battle was no longer behaving like a traditional confrontation. It was becoming structured resistance inside chaos. And then came the first micro twist. that none of the opposing commanders anticipated. One of their subunits misread movement and shifted too early, opening a gap in their formation. Temujin noticed it immediately, not as luck, as pattern failure, and he directed a concentrated strike into that exact space, not wide, not scattered, focused. For the first time in the battle, the larger force was forced to step back. It was small, almost insignificant in scale, but psychologically, it changed everything. Because armies do not break only from loss, they break from expectation failing, and that gap widened. The opposing confidence began to fracture in real time, not because they were losing decisively, but because they were not winning quickly. And in battles built on numbers, delay becomes doubt, doubt becomes hesitation, and hesitation becomes collapse. Temujin's forces, though fewer, began to synchronize more tightly as pressure increased, not because they were stronger, but because survival required unity, and unity under pressure becomes precision. Then came the second turning point. A sudden shift in wind direction carried dust directly into the eyes of the larger force's front line. Visibility dropped. Commands became harder to hear. Coordination weakened, and Temujin used it without hesitation. He pushed forward at the exact moment when the enemy's structure became least stable, not blindly, but calculated through observation. And this moment became the beginning of reversal. The larger force, still greater in number, began to lose shape. Units started acting independently. Communication broke down. Fear replaced coordination, and what was supposed to be overwhelming force turned into scattered resistance. Temujin's smaller army did not chase victory. They maintained pressure, controlled movement, contained panic, and slowly the larger force began to retreat, not in full defeat, but in fragmented withdrawal. And that fragmentation mattered more than the battle itself, because it proved something no one expected. Numbers alone were not enough, not against structure, not against adaptation. Under pressure. When the battle ended, silence returned to the field in a way that felt heavier than before. His men stood still, not celebrating, not fully understanding what had just happened, because they had seen the numbers, they had felt the imbalance, and yet the outcome defied expectation. Temujin did not speak immediately. He looked across the field as if studying something invisible, not victory, but confirmation. Because this was no longer survival, this was validation of a method, and somewhere beyond the visible horizon, those who had opposed him began to understand something unsettling. He was not breaking under pressure. He was becoming more precise because of it. And that realization would travel faster than any messenger, because wars are not only fought on fields, they are fought in perception. And now, for the first time, his enemies were beginning to question what kind of force they were actually facing. Not a boy surviving the steppe, but something that turned pressure into structure, and structure into momentum. And momentum, once proven in battle, does not stay small for long. It spreads slowly, inevitably, and without permission. After the battle, there should have been relief, a moment of pause, a sense that survival had once again held its ground against impossible odds. But instead, what followed was something far more unsettling. Silence that did not feel like peace, but like waiting. Because victories in the steppe do not end conflict. They announce you to everyone who has not yet decided to destroy you. Temujin stood among his men as they recovered from the clash. Fewer losses than expected, more cohesion than before. And yet something about the aftermath felt wrong, not in what had happened, but in what was now coming, because scattered survivors from the opposing force were already disappearing into the horizon. And they were not running in confusion, they were running with purpose. Information was moving faster than pursuit, and that was the real danger. News of the outcome would not remain local, it would travel, and when it did, it would not describe a defensive survival. It would describe something far more threatening to those watching from a distance, a smaller force that refused to collapse, and instead reorganized the battlefield itself. Temujin understood this immediately because he was no longer thinking like someone reacting to events. He was thinking like someone being measured by them. Then came the shift that changed everything again. A messenger arrived, not from the battlefield, but from deeper within the fractured political landscape around them. He carried no celebration, no acknowledgement of the recent outcome, only information. Jamuka had begun to move openly, not as a distant rival anymore, but as an organizing force. He was gathering tribes, not through fear alone, but through narrative. He was describing Temujin not as a survivor, but as a disruption, something that did not belong in the existing order, something that, if left alone, would dissolve the balance of the steppe entirely. And this was more dangerous than any army, because armies can be fought, narratives spread before they can be confronted. For the first time, Temujin was not just being opposed in the field, he was being defined from outside, and definition in that world determines allegiance. Then came the second shock. Some of the smaller groups that had recently aligned with Temujin began to hesitate.
We followed you, Temujin, but many starve now.
Not all at once, not openly, but in subtle withdrawals, delayed responses, missing envoys, shifts in loyalty that did not declare themselves directly. Temujin noticed it quickly, because he had seen this pattern before. Stability does not collapse in one moment. It leaks quietly from multiple places at once, and then it becomes irreversible. And this is where the situation changed from military pressure to existential pressure. Because now even as earlier victory was being reinterpreted among rival groups, the battle was no longer seen as an anomaly. It was being reframed as a warning. If he could win while outnumbered once, then he could potentially survive again. And that possibility was more dangerous than defeat itself, because it forced enemies to act earlier, before he grew further, before structure became empire, before momentum became unstoppable. Temujin did not respond with panic. He responded with silence and planning. But inside his camp, something else was happening. His men were no longer just asking who the enemy was. They were beginning to ask how long this could continue, because every victory brought new retaliation. Every success increased attention, and attention meant escalation. Then, without warning, another fracture appeared. A group within his own ranks attempted to leave quietly during the night, not in rebellion, not in confrontation, but in fear of what was coming next. They did not believe in defeat, they believed in accumulation of enemies, and accumulation always ends the same way in their world. Temujin intercepted them before they fully disappeared, not with violence, not immediately, but with presence and silence. He did not ask why they were leaving, because he already knew. He simply stood there long enough for them to realize what their absence would mean in a world where safety no longer existed outside structure. And slowly, some returned, not because they were convinced, but because uncertainty outside his influence had already become worse than uncertainty inside it. And this realization came another hidden turning point. Not loyalty through belief, but loyalty through comparison of fear. And that is a fragile but powerful foundation in unstable times. Meanwhile, far beyond immediate sight, Jamuka's coalition was growing, not uniformly, not perfectly, but steadily. And with every new group that joined him, the conflict was becoming less about two individuals and more about two systems of survival competing for the same world. One built on tradition and punishment, the other forming through adaptation and structure. And between them, everything else was slowly being forced to choose. Temujin stood alone one evening, watching the horizon where nothing visible was happening, but everything was already in motion. Because in wars like this, the most important battles are not the ones being fought, they are the ones being prepared. And somewhere in that silence, he understood something deeply unsettling. This was no longer about surviving enemies, it was about surviving the consequences of becoming known. And that was a different kind of war, entirely. One that does not end with victory, only with expansion or collapse. And the next movement would decide which direction history would begin to take. The situation did not escalate loudly, it tightened, like a rope slowly pulled from both ends until even breathing begins to feel controlled. Temujin could feel it before he saw it. The steppe itself seemed different. Messages arrived slower. Silences between allies became longer. And when people spoke, they chose words more carefully, as if every sentence might later be repeated to someone else. This was no longer simple instability. This was alignment forming on both sides. Then the declaration came, not as a formal announcement delivered with honor, but as a message carried through multiple intermediaries, reshaped slightly each time it passed through different hands. Jamuka had openly begun positioning himself as the defender of traditional order. He did not name Temujin as a rival in simple terms. He named him as a threat to balance, a disruption to the way things had always been, a force that, if allowed to grow, would erase the structure of tribal authority itself. And in the steppe, fear spreads faster when it is justified as protection. What had once been rivalry was now becoming ideology, and ideology does not resolve itself, it expands. Temujin received the message in silence, no reaction in front of his men, no immediate command. But inside, he understood the shift clearly. This was no longer about territory. It was no longer about revenge or personal conflict. It was about legitimacy. Who had the right to lead, and who had to be removed for order to exist? Then, the pressure increased again. Tribes that had previously remained neutral began aligning publicly. Not all at once, but in a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Each day, another group declared support for Jamuka's coalition, not because they all agreed with him, but because uncertainty is more dangerous than opposition. And Jamuka was offering certainty, even if it came through fear. Temujin's camp began to feel the shift internally, not through open rebellion, but through hesitation that grew heavier with each passing day. Some of his men began asking quiet questions that had no safe answers. What happens if the coalition arrives in full strength? What happens if they cannot be stopped? What happens if survival this time is not possible? Temujin did not answer with reassurance. He rarely did. Instead, he began restructuring again. Smaller units, tighter coordination, clearer roles. But this time, something had changed in his approach. He was no longer preparing only for battle. He was preparing for sustained pressure, for a war that would not end quickly. And that realization itself began to alter the mindset of those around him, because preparation for long conflict changes people. It removes illusions of quick resolution. It replaces hope with endurance. Then came the first sign that the war was no longer approaching. It had already begun. A border group aligned with Temujin was attacked without warning. Not by Jamuka himself, but by one of the newly aligned coalition factions. The attack was swift, decisive, and designed to send a message rather than occupy land. When the survivors returned, they did not bring just news of defeat. They brought something worse, fear that the next strike would not be isolated. It would be coordinated. Temujin listened without interruption, but this time, something in his response changed, not emotionally, strategically. He stopped treating each incident as separate and began seeing them as parts of a single, expanding structure, a system preparing itself for convergence. Then another fracture appeared inside his own group. A small faction attempted to defect during the night, not loudly, not violently, but with quiet intention to leave before the coming storm fully arrived. This time, Temujin did not stop them immediately. He observed first, and what he saw confirmed his understanding. They were not leaving because they disbelieved him. They were leaving because they believed the scale of what was coming could not be survived by anyone. It was not rejection of leadership. It was fear of inevitability, and that was more dangerous than betrayal, because fear spreads faster than loyalty ever can. Temujin eventually confronted them, not with anger, not with persuasion, but with a single question: where will you go?
Where will you go?
That does not lead you back into the same war. There was no answer, because there was none. And slowly, some of them stayed, not fully convinced, but aware that leaving did not remove danger. It only removed structure. Meanwhile, Jamuka's coalition completed its formation. The steppe now had two visible centers of gravity, and everything else was being pulled toward one of them. Neutrality was disappearing, silence was becoming alignment, and every tribe that had not chosen yet was now being forced toward decision. Temujin stood alone one evening as the wind moved across the grass like an endless wave. There was no battle happening at that moment, but everything already felt like conflict, and for the first time, he understood something without needing confirmation. The next confrontation would not be small. It would not be accidental. And it would not end with retreat. It would decide which system of survival would shape the future of the steppe. And in that realization, there was no excitement, only clarity. Because once a war becomes ideological, it does not resolve. It continues until one side is completely replaced, and the next movement was already being prepared on both sides, without anyone needing to speak it aloud. Temujin no longer faced resistance in the same way. It changed shape instead. The steppe that once pushed against him was now slowly bending under him, not in a single moment of victory, but through a chain of conflicts where each defeat he caused made the next opposition weaker before it even began. And what began as survival had now become expansion. At first, it was difficult to recognize the shift because even his victories still looked like battles, still felt like resistance, still carried loss, exhaustion, and uncertainty. But something fundamental had changed underneath it all. The scale of opposition was no longer growing faster than his control. It was slowing down, and that was the first silent sign of empire formation. Not declared, not announced, but mathematically inevitable. One campaign ended, then another. Then another tribe that once aligned against him disappeared into submission, absorption, or destruction. And each time, something unexpected happened. He did not only defeat groups, he integrated structure. He absorbed people into a system that did not collapse after conflict. It reorganized itself. And this is where history begins to shift from warlord behavior into something larger, something that no longer depended on individual battle, but on continuous control. As his influence expanded, fear changed its form around him. At first, enemies feared defeat. Then they feared his strategy, and eventually they began to fear even proximity to him because association itself became dangerous. And this is where the myth begins without being named. Stories started spreading across the steppe, not written, not recorded, only spoken in fragments during travel, trade, and fear-filled silence at night. Some said he never forgot a betrayal. Some said he could see weakness in people before they spoke. Some said he didn't sleep like others, but stayed awake through entire nights without explanation. And none of these were confirmed, but none needed to be. Because in unstable lands, uncertainty becomes belief, faster than truth ever can. And belief is what creates myth, but behind the growing reputation, something more structured was forming. His empire was no longer just territory, it was organization. Rules replaced tribal randomness. Loyalty was no longer based only on blood, it was based on function. And for the first time in steppe history, individuals could rise without ancestry, or fall without warning. This system created stability, but also fear, because unpredictability had not disappeared. It had been centralized, and centralized power always feels closer, more personal, more absolute. Then came one of the most important transformations in his rise, the transition from conqueror to ruler.
I am the strength of the eternal sky. With this army, we will conquer the world.
From movement to permanence, from war to structure. And with that transition, something else began to form in the background. Wealth, not in the simple sense of gold or possession, but in controlled accumulation. Tribute from conquered groups, resources from absorbed territories, and redistribution through loyalty systems. But unlike traditional rulers of the time, there were almost no personal displays of excess tied to him, and this absence became its own mystery. Because people expected rulers to accumulate visibly, to display wealth, to build symbols of personal power. But Temujin did something different. He built systems that distributed rather than showcased. And this created one of the earliest contradictions in his legacy. Where did the true wealth go? And who controlled it? Over time, this silence around personal possession turned into speculation. Some believed he stored immense hidden treasures across remote regions, protected not by vaults, but by loyalty networks that no outsider could map. Others believed his wealth was never material at all, but organizational control over people, routes, and trade itself. And both theories survived because neither could be fully disproven. As his empire expanded further, even death itself became part of his strategic design. He did not allow simple expectations around legacy. Burial traditions, secrecy, and movement of information around his final resting place became intentionally unclear. And this is where historical mystery begins to attach itself to him permanently. Because unlike many rulers whose lives are documented through visible monuments, his absence created more questions than answers. No confirmed resting place, no universally verified burial site, only scattered accounts, contradictions, and silence. And silence in history is never neutral. It becomes a space where imagination replaces fact, But before the story reaches that point, his empire reached its greatest expansion, not in a single campaign, but through continuous pressure across multiple regions until resistance stopped functioning as unified opposition. Borders were no longer fixed. They became zones of influence, and within that system, movement itself became controlled. Trade routes, communication paths, and tribal alliances all began orbiting a central authority that no longer needed constant war to maintain itself, because at that stage, fear alone was no longer enough. Structure had taken over, and structure is far more stable than fear. And yet, even at the height of expansion, something remained unresolved, because every system built through conquest carries unanswered tension beneath it. And in his case, the tension would not fully disappear. It would instead transform into legacy, mystery, and myth. And that is where the story begins to shift again, from empire building to what remains after empires, the silence of history, the uncertainty of burial, the unanswered questions of hidden wealth, and the theories that would follow him far beyond his lifetime. Because some rulers are remembered for what they built, but others are remembered for what was never found. And in his case, both would become equally powerful. Before the empire reaches its final silence, there is a phase of his life that history often reduces to dates and campaigns. But in reality, it carried something far more human underneath the weight of expansion, because even at the height of his power, Temujin was not untouched by loss. Not everything he built remained unbroken. Not every victory felt like victory. And not every moment of control removed uncertainty from his life. There were times when the empire itself felt too large even for the man who created it. Too many moving parts, too many loyalties that depended on fear, distance, and structure rather than trust. And in those quieter gaps between campaigns, something more personal began to surface. Memories, faces from the past that no amount of conquest could erase. One of the most emotionally heavy parts of his later life came not from battle, but from internal fractures within his own legacy. Sons who did not see the world the same way. Commanders whose loyalty was shaped by ambition rather than unity. And a growing realization that building an empire does not guarantee that the empire will remain one piece after you are gone. There were moments when Temujin would observe disputes among his own successors and say nothing for long stretches of time, not because he lacked control, but because he understood something uncomfortable. He had created a system that outlived personal emotion, and systems do not feel loyalty in the way people imagine. They only follow structure until structure weakens, and beneath that awareness was something quieter, a human cost that rarely gets recorded. People who had been part of his earliest life were no longer present in the same way. Some were lost to earlier conflicts. Some faded into obscurity as the empire absorbed their identities into larger administrative roles, and some simply disappeared into the distance of history, leaving behind no clear trace except the fact that they once mattered to him. There are accounts that suggest moments of restraint in his later campaigns that feel almost contradictory to his reputation. Cities that could have been destroyed completely were instead absorbed under conditions of surrender. Groups that resisted but later submitted were sometimes integrated rather than erased, not out of softness, but calculation. Because by this stage, he understood something that earlier rulers often failed to grasp. Destruction creates enemies faster than it removes them, but structure can convert enemies into function. And yet, there were also moments where that structure broke into something far more severe. Not because he lost control, but because resistance reached a level where negotiation no longer existed. Entire regions experienced consequences that were meant not only to defeat opposition, but to prevent future defiance. And this duality became one of the most difficult contradictions in his legacy. A ruler capable of strategic integration and absolute punishment, both existing in the same lifetime. But one of the most emotionally complex stories from his later years is not about conquest at all. It is about trust. There are accounts surrounding internal betrayal within his closest circle. People who had risen with him from the earliest unstable years. Individuals who had survived exile, hunger, and displacement alongside him. And yet, as the empire stabilized, ambition began to reshape relationships from within. The closer people got to the center of power, the more fragile loyalty became. In one significant moment, preserved through historical narrative traditions, a trusted companion who had once shared the most difficult early journeys allegedly turned against him during a period of political tension. What makes this moment important is not only the betrayal itself, but Temujin's response. He did not react immediately. He observed, he confirmed, he allowed the structure of truth to reveal itself before acting on emotion. And when action finally came, it was not impulsive, it was absolute. Because in his system of rule, betrayal was not treated as personal offense. It was treated as structural threat, something that could spread if left unresolved. And this is where the emotional weight of his leadership becomes most visible, because decisions like this were not detached from feeling. They were made despite it, not because he lacked emotion, but because he believed survival of the system required emotional restraint at the highest level. Still, there were quieter moments that suggest a different side of him that rarely appears in conquest narratives, moments of reflection during long periods of movement across vast territories, moments where the scale of what he had built may have created a distance even from himself. The empire was no longer something he could fully step away from. It moved with him and around him and through him. And that kind of existence creates a strange isolation, even at the center of absolute control, because there is no equal point of reference left, only direction, forward or collapse. And as he grew older, that pressure became less about expansion and more about preservation, not of land, but of continuity, of order, of a system that could survive his absence. This is where the emotional undertone of his later life becomes most significant, because even the strongest empires do not remove the human awareness of time, and time, in the end, affects everything equally. There are also accounts suggesting he became more deliberate in managing succession and communication toward the final phase of his life, aware that instability after his departure could undo much of what he had built, not through enemies outside, but through fragmentation inside. And that awareness itself carries a quiet heaviness, because building something larger than yourself also means accepting that it may not remain unified. In the final phase of his life, the empire no longer felt like something expanding outward. It felt like something being carefully held together, not through conquest, but through control of distance, communication, and time. Temujin was older now, and age in the steppe does not arrive gently. It arrives through silence between movements, through longer pauses before decisions, through the growing awareness that every campaign could also be the last one you personally witness. And yet, even in this stage, the world around him did not slow down. Messages still arrived, conflicts still formed, and distant regions still required attention from a center that had become too large for any single human presence to fully manage. Then came the final campaign, not announced with ceremony, not framed as destiny, but as necessity. A conflict that arose on the edge of the empire, where instability threatened to fracture influence that had taken decades to build. Temujin did not send only generals. He chose to move himself. This decision itself would later become part of the mystery surrounding his final days, because powerful rulers rarely leave the center unless the situation demands absolute presence, and this one did. The journey was long, slower than earlier campaigns, more deliberate. There were accounts of him observing the land in silence during movement, as if measuring not just territory, but the weight of everything that had been built upon it. Along the way, something unusual is often mentioned in historical fragments. He did not display urgency, even when dealing with conflict, even when receiving reports of resistance. It was as if the final campaign was not only about military resolution, but something else layered beneath it that no one around him fully understood. The confrontation itself, when it occurred, did not unfold as a single dramatic moment. It was a series of coordinated engagements, controlled pressure, strategic containment rather than chaotic warfare. And once again, despite resistance, the structure he had built, the opposing forces were gradually broken, not through a single decisive strike, but through sustained imbalance, until opposition stopped functioning as unity. and became scattered survival. But what followed the campaign is where history becomes uncertain, because after this period, accounts begin to diverge. Some describe him as returning toward the heart of the empire. Others suggest he remained in movement between regions, and some narratives imply that his condition had begun to decline during this final phase, though details remain inconsistent across sources. What is consistent, however, is that his presence became less visible. Messages replaced direct appearances more frequently. Decisions were increasingly carried out through structured command rather than personal oversight. And this gradual withdrawal created a strange atmosphere across the empire. Not collapse, but anticipation, as if even those serving under him sensed that a final transition was approaching, though no one could define its shape. Then came the final moments. Accounts of his death are not unified. They do not agree on exact location. They do not agree on exact cause. And this lack of clarity is where one of history's most enduring mysteries begins. Some traditions suggest illness, others suggest complications from injury, and some accounts remain intentionally vague, as if the uncertainty itself was part of what followed. What is consistent is that his passing was not publicly displayed in the way many rulers' deaths were. There was no immediate global announcement in the modern sense. Instead, there was controlled silence, movement of his body away from public visibility, and a deliberate effort by those closest to him to ensure that the exact location of his burial would not be easily discovered. This is where legend begins to replace record, because the escort that carried him away reportedly took extreme measures to preserve secrecy. Routes were concealed, witnesses were limited, and even those involved in the process were bound by strict internal control that ensured the location would not become common knowledge. And then, according to multiple traditions, those who carried out the burial arrangements were also removed from the living world shortly afterward. Not as myth alone, but as part of a structure designed to eliminate the possibility of disclosure. And from this point forward, certainty disappears. What remains are theories. Some believe he was buried in a remote and inaccessible region of the Mongolian landscape, hidden deliberately beneath natural terrain that would not draw attention. Others suggest that no single grave exists at all, but rather a distributed concealment strategy, making identification impossible even if parts were discovered. And then there are theories about hidden wealth, that treasures accumulated during the height of the empire were not stored in a central vault, but moved, divided, and concealed across multiple secure locations, protected not by architecture, but by secrecy itself. And because no definitive burial site has ever been confirmed with absolute certainty, all of these ideas continue to exist at the same time, not as proven fact, but as overlapping possibility. And this uncertainty becomes part of his legacy, because unlike rulers whose history is anchored to physical monuments, Temujin's final presence was defined by absence. No confirmed tomb, no universally accepted resting place, only the scale of what remained behind. An empire that continued to shape regions long after his physical disappearance, and a mystery that became larger over time instead of smaller. Because history can preserve conquest, but it struggles to preserve silence. And in his case, silence became the most powerful artifact of all. After his death, the empire did not disappear. It shifted, and that shift is one of the most important lessons in understanding how large systems survive beyond the people who create them. Because what Temujin built was no longer dependent on his physical presence. It had become a structure, and structures do not die the same way humans do. At first, there was controlled continuity. His appointed successors moved quickly to maintain stability across the vast territories. Orders were still followed, communication still functioned, and the appearance of unity was preserved with careful discipline. But beneath that surface, pressure began to build almost immediately, because succession in any large empire is never just administrative. It is psychological. People who were once unified by a single center of authority suddenly begin recalculating their position in relation to multiple centers of influence, and that recalculation begins quietly. Not with open rebellion, but with hesitation, delays in response, shifting loyalty, and interpretation of authority instead of obedience to it. Temujin's empire was designed with strong organizational logic, but even the strongest systems cannot fully eliminate human ambition, especially at the top. His sons and close successors inherited not just territory, but competing visions of how that territory should be controlled. Some leaned toward expansion.
We must expand the empire now while the momentum favors us.
Others toward consolidation. Some prioritized military dominance, others focused on administrative control and internal stability. And these differences did not remain theoretical for long. They began to influence decisions on the ground. In distant regions, local commanders started receiving slightly different interpretations of authority, depending on which successor's influence was strongest in their chain of command. This created the first real cracks, not visible as collapse, but as divergence. And divergence, when left unresolved, slowly turns unified systems into fragmented ones. At the same time, something else began happening. The memory of Temujin himself started transforming. During his life, he was a political and military reality. After his death, he began becoming something else entirely, a symbol. Different groups across the empire began emphasizing different aspects of his legacy. Some remembered him as a unifier who brought structure to chaos. Others remembered him as an uncompromising force who enforced order through absolute control. And both interpretations were used to justify very different political decisions. This is a key moment in historical evolution, when a ruler stops being a person in memory and becomes a tool in ideology. And once that happens, the original intent becomes less important than the interpretation. Meanwhile, the mystery surrounding his burial began to grow rather than fade. Because unlike many historical figures whose resting places become pilgrimage sites or confirmed archaeological locations, his did not stabilize into certainty. Instead, it remained deliberately unclear, and that uncertainty created space for centuries of speculation. Some historians and traditions suggest he was buried in a highly restricted and geographically concealed location, chosen specifically to avoid future disturbance or political symbolism. Others argue that the secrecy itself was the point, not the exact geography. Because in steppe culture, an early imperial strategy, control did not end with life. It extended into memory, and controlling memory meant controlling location, access, and knowledge. Over time, this led to one of the most persistent archaeological mysteries in world history, the search for his tomb. Despite extensive exploration efforts in modern times, no universally confirmed burial site has ever been discovered. This has led to multiple theories ranging from intentional environmental concealment to deliberate destruction of records and witnesses. And because no definitive evidence has emerged, the mystery remains open. Alongside this, legends about hidden wealth also developed, not necessarily in the form of a single legendary treasure chamber, but as a more complex idea that resources accumulated during the expansion of the empire may have been distributed across multiple secure systems, protected not by visibility, but by fragmentation. In other words, wealth that was designed not to be found in one place, but to remain functionally invisible unless the entire system was understood. This idea aligns with how the empire itself was structured. Decentralized control under centralized authority, which makes the theory plausible in principle, even if unverified in detail. And, as centuries passed, both the tomb mystery and treasure theories became part of his larger legacy, not just historical questions, but cultural narratives, because when physical evidence is missing, imagination becomes part of history continuation. In modern historical study, he is often analyzed not only as a conqueror, but as a systems builder, someone who transformed fragmented tribal structures into a coordinated political and military framework across vast geography, a system that, even after fragmentation, influenced successor states and regional power structures long after his death. And this is perhaps the most educational conclusion to his story, that his greatest impact was not only what he conquered during his lifetime, but what continued to function, evolve, and fracture after him, because empires are not only measured by how they rise, but by how long their structure continues to shape the world after the builder is gone. And in that sense, the story of Temujin does not end with his death. It continues through every system, conflict, and legacy that followed, and through the unanswered silence of where he finally rests. And perhaps that is where the greatest mystery truly begins, because when most rulers die, they leave behind monuments. Temujin left questions. Somewhere across the vast landscapes of Mongolia, beneath mountains, forests, rivers, or forgotten valleys, there may still be a place that has remained untouched for more than 8 centuries, a place connected to the most powerful man the steppe ever produced. No confirmed tomb, no universally accepted burial site, no final answer, only theories. Some historians have suggested that his resting place may lie somewhere within the remote regions associated with the sacred mountain known as Burkun Khaldun. Others believe the truth may be hidden somewhere far beyond the areas that researchers have searched. And then there is the question of treasure, not merely gold, not merely jewels, but the accumulated wealth of an empire that stretched across continents, caravans, tribute, trade routes, resources gathered from lands separated by thousands of miles. Where did it all go? Was it divided among successors, hidden within the empire's vast territories, buried alongside secrets that were never meant to be found? No one knows with certainty, and perhaps that uncertainty is the point, because the Mongol Empire changed the world. Yet one of its greatest secrets remains locked somewhere within history itself. Even today, explorers, archaeologists, and historians continue searching for answers, not only to find a tomb, but to understand what was intentionally hidden, what was protected, and what may still be waiting beneath the earth. So when you think of Genghis Khan, do not only think of conquest, think of the silence that followed. A silence so complete that after more than 800 years, the world is still asking the same questions. Where is he? What was buried with him? And what secrets are still sleeping beneath the endless horizons of Mongolia? Perhaps one day those answers will be found. Or perhaps the greatest treasure he left behind was the mystery itself. And if that mystery has carried his name across 8 centuries, it may continue to do so for many more. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most remarkable lives. Until next time, rest well and let history continue its quiet conversation through the night.
History did not end. It was only lost.